A grotesquely swollen body, agony that drove him to madness, and a stench so foul it caused courtiers to collapse. When he finally died, putrid bodily fluids seeped from his coffin, only to be licked up by stray dogs. This wasn't a horror story, it was the real revolting end of one of history's most terrifying monarchs. Today, we uncover the grim and seldom told truth behind the death of Henry VIII of England, a tale so repulsive, so macabre, that history itself has tried to bury it. Henry Tudor was born on June 28, 1491. When he ascended the throne at just 17 years old, he wasn't merely a king, he was a vision of chivalric perfection. Towering in stature, athletic, with flowing golden red hair and a regal presence, he quickly earned a reputation as Europe's most handsome prince. A Venetian ambassador once declared that Henry possessed an extraordinary figure and angelic countenance, superior in beauty to any other Christian ruler of the time. So how did this icon of virility and power descend into such a nightmarishly humiliating death? The turning point came with a single brutal moment, an accident that took place in January 1536 during a jousting tournament at Greenwich. At 44, the once vigorous king suffered a catastrophic fall when his horse collapsed beneath him in full gallop. He was knocked unconscious for 2 long hours, and although he survived, the incident left him with a ghastly leg injury, one that would never fully heal. The wound festered into a constantly weeping ulcer, oozing pus and emitting such a sickening stench that it preceded him into any room. For a man of immense pride and ego, it was a cruel, relentless humiliation. Courtiers were forced to endure the reek in silence. Any sign of disgust could provoke royal fury and swift punishment. But the injury did more than ravage his body. It may have warped his mind. Coinciding with this physical decline was a disturbing shift in his behavior. That same year, Henry condemned his second wife, Anne Boleyn, to death, accusing her of adultery and treason on charges that many historians now believe were fabricated. Some experts speculate that the head trauma he sustained in the fall could have triggered or worsened existing tendencies toward paranoia, impulsive cruelty, and explosive rage. As his mobility declined, so too did his physique. The once slender waist that measured 89 centimeters in youth swelled to over 130. His body ballooned to more than 180 kilograms, rendering him so immobile that palace servants had to use an elaborate pulley system to hoist him between rooms. Door frames across his residences were widened to accommodate his massive bulk. His royal diet only hastened the deterioration. Meticulous kitchen records reveal that Henry consumed upward of 5,000 calories a day, primarily from an endless rotation of red meats, virtually untouched by fruits or vegetables. A typical royal dinner was an orgy of indulgence: thick meat pies, heaping platters of roasted game, and rivers of wine and beer. This relentless regimen of gluttony, combined with forced immobility, drastically accelerated Henry's physical collapse. The festering ulcers on his legs grew worse with time, turning into gaping wounds that defied healing. His physicians, operating under the limited medical understanding of the era, applied treatments that today would be considered barbaric. They burned his flesh with red-hot irons, smeared his sores with concoctions laced with arsenic and mercury, and repeatedly drained his blood in the belief it would restore balance. In reality, each intervention only brought him closer to death. The ulcers became so grotesque that bones were visible through the rotting tissue. The stench was so vile it wafted through the palace, often announcing his approach from 3 rooms away. At 49, Henry married Catherine Howard, a vivacious young woman barely 19. He deluded himself into believing this marriage would be a return to youth, a chance to reclaim the vigor that once defined him. In truth, the union was a macabre farce. His bloated, misshapen body and overwhelming odor made the match a nightmarish spectacle. Catherine, repulsed and emotionally suffocated, sought solace in the arms of a young courtier. When the affair was uncovered, Henry responded with the fury of a betrayed god. Both lovers were executed, their blood sealing yet another chapter of tragedy in his reign. His final marriage, to Catherine Parr in 1543, was less a romantic endeavor than a calculated alliance. Catherine took on the role of caregiver rather than queen, tending to the ailing monarch with an astonishing degree of patience and loyalty, especially given the fate of the women who had come before her. By this time, Henry was a ruin of a man. Modern medical historians believe he likely suffered from a host of debilitating conditions: uncontrolled diabetes, advanced gout, chronic hypertension, and congestive heart failure. Some theories point to syphilis as well, though that diagnosis remains a topic of debate. Regardless of the exact cause, the result was the same. His final years were a parade of suffering. Eyewitnesses of the time painted a portrait of a man broken not just in body, but in spirit. He swung between spells of excruciating agony, screaming, cursing, lashing out at anyone within reach, and periods of crushing melancholy, during which he would sit for hours in total silence, unmoving, consumed by despair. As his health declined, so did his mind. Paranoia took deep root, choking out any remaining reason. The once brilliant statesman became a tyrant, haunted by imaginary threats. Longtime friends and trusted advisors were imprisoned or beheaded, victims of delusions and whispered suspicions. The court was gripped by terror. A careless word, an unreadable glance, even a perceived hesitation could lead to accusations of treason and a swift, brutal end. In a final act of cruelty and fear, Henry ordered the execution of his cousin, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, just 9 days before his own death. His dread of poison had by then reached obsessive levels. No dish reached his lips until it was tasted by servants. Every utensil was scrutinized for tampering. The king, who had once ruled with unmatched confidence, now ate in constant fear, surrounded by food, luxury, and death. This growing obsession with poisoning may have been a symptom of Henry's unraveling mental state, or perhaps the result of repeated minor strokes that quietly chipped away at his faculties. As the end drew near, the king's suffering escalated to nearly unimaginable levels. In his final months, he was virtually immobile, unable to move even with assistance. Gangrene had consumed his legs, turning the existing stench into something so overwhelming it choked the air in his chambers. The royal court became a theater of miasma and dread. Courtiers, desperate to conceal their revulsion, pressed perfume-soaked handkerchiefs to their faces as they forced themselves to endure the presence of their dying sovereign. Through the bitter winter of 1546 to 1547, Henry's health deteriorated at an alarming pace. He was racked by recurring fevers, almost certainly the result of septicemia caused by the rampant infections devouring his body from within. Breathing became increasingly labored, and hallucinations took hold. He often slipped into states of delirium, murmuring incoherently as he hovered between reality and nightmare. Those in attendance reported that, in these moments, the king repeatedly whispered the names of his deceased wives, most notably Jane Seymour, who had died bearing his only legitimate son. Some claimed he also uttered the name of Anne Boleyn, whose spectral presence, it was said, haunted him in the dead of night. Yet despite the overwhelming evidence of his impending demise, no one at court dared to speak the truth. Under English law, it was considered high treason to predict the death of the monarch. So, the charade of recovery continued. Physicians mumbled optimistic diagnoses. Courtiers offered empty reassurances, even as the unmistakable odor of decomposition began to seep from the king's living body. On January 27, 1547, the illusion finally collapsed. Realizing that death was imminent, Henry summoned Archbishop Thomas Cranmer to his bedside. Unable to speak, he made a final silent gesture, squeezing Cranmer's hand when asked if he died in the Christian faith. This was the last flicker of consciousness from a man who had once ruled with absolute command. In the early hours of January 28th, at 55 years old, Henry VIII, the Lion of Tudor England, drew his final breath. But even in death, Henry's ordeal did not end. His vast, misshapen body presented logistical nightmares for those tasked with his burial. A specially constructed coffin had to be built to contain his immense frame. Preparing the remains for the funeral was a gruesome endeavor. Embalming in the 16th century was a crude process. The internal organs were removed, and the resulting cavities packed with aromatic herbs. It was an attempt to mask the inevitable decay, but it was not enough. As the body lay in state, awaiting its royal funeral, one of the most macabre episodes in Tudor history unfolded. The coffin, hastily and inadequately sealed, failed to contain the pressure and fluids of decomposition. While resting in the chapel of Sion Abbey, it began to leak. During the night, a horrific scene was discovered. Putrefactive fluid had seeped through the wood, spilling onto the chapel floor. There, it was found by stray dogs, licking at the foul discharge from the once mighty king. This harrowing episode, documented by contemporary chroniclers, stands as one of the most humiliating ends ever recorded for a monarch who had spent his life constructing an image of power, majesty, and divine authority. The once mighty Henry VIII, who had defied the Pope, sundered the English Church from Rome, and condemned two of his wives to death, ended his life not as a sovereign, but as a bloated, rotting mass of flesh. His dignity undone, his corpse defiled by scavenging animals, he became the antithesis of the grandeur he had once embodied. It wasn't until February 16th, 1547, nearly 3 weeks after his death, that his funeral finally took place. Despite the noxious stench that seeped from the coffin, the ceremonies unfolded with all the pageantry expected of a king of Henry's stature. The great monarch was interred at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who had delivered the prize he had so desperately sought. A male heir, the future Edward VI, and yet the irony of Henry's legacy echoed long after his burial. Edward, the fragile boy whose birth had shaped the destiny of a nation, ruled for only 6 years before dying of illness at the age of 15. The crown then passed to Mary I, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, who fervently attempted to reverse her father's Protestant reforms, restoring Catholicism in a brief and brutal reign. After Mary came Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, the very queen Henry had executed, who would usher in one of the most celebrated eras in English history, the Elizabethan Golden Age. Thus, the grotesque death of Henry VIII is more than just a personal tragedy. It stands as a brutal reminder of the limits of human power. Here was a man who saw himself above earthly laws, who shaped a religion with his will and discarded lives like pawns on a board. But in the end, even he could not escape the frailty of the flesh. Death stripped him of majesty, revealed the man beneath the crown, and laid bare the decay, both physical and moral, that had long festered behind the throne. English historian Alison Weir aptly wrote, "It is one of the great paradoxes of history that a man who began with so much promise, beauty, and ability ended as a grotesque caricature of himself. Tormented by physical pain and mental instability, feared and flattered by those around him, but rarely truly loved." The transformation of Henry VIII from an ideal Renaissance prince to an obese, paranoid tyrant remains one of history's most compelling case studies. It illustrates how unchecked power, relentless ambition, chronic pain, and progressive disease can corrode the soul as surely as they ravage the body. And yet, his political legacy endures. The break with Rome and the birth of the Church of England, decisions made in pursuit of personal desire, reverberate through history to this very day. Henry VIII's life may have ended in horror, but the seismic changes he set in motion continue to shape the world we live in. But the personal end of Henry VIII stands as a haunting reminder of human fragility. His final moments, his labored breathing, swollen limbs, and grotesquely deformed body stand in stark contrast to the regal portraits that immortalized him in his prime, broad-chested, resolute, crowned with authority. This jarring dissonance between the grandeur of his public image and the horror of his private reality is one of the most powerful and enduring lessons of his life and death. Thus ended the existence of one of history's most infamous monarchs, not with triumph, not with glory, but with an unbearable stench, a shattered body, and an end unworthy of his crown. The man who transformed England, who bent religion, law, and custom to his will, succumbed in the end, as we all do, to the merciless decay of the flesh. Henry VIII's death was not just a moment in history, it was a symbol, a moment that forced the court and posterity to reckon with the ephemeral nature of power itself. As his once mighty body crumbled into infection and pain, so too did the myth of royal invincibility. The divine institution of monarchy, long shielded by ritual and reverence, was suddenly laid bare, mortal, vulnerable, and disturbingly human. Perhaps the final irony in Henry's story is the cruel twist of fate that saw his desperate quest for a male heir end in disappointment. He broke with the church, executed wives, and reshaped the very fabric of his kingdom for the sake of a son, only for that son, Edward VI, to die at the tender age of 15. In the end, it was his daughters who would carry forward his true legacy. His death was not just a tale of medical horror, it was a moral reckoning. A slow, grotesque unraveling of flesh that turned the once ideal body of a Renaissance prince into a harrowing symbol of the transience of earthly glory. The rot that consumed him in life became the metaphor for the collapse of illusion. This story reminds us that beneath every throne is a body destined to fall. That behind every crown is a mortal skull. The terrible death of Henry VIII continues to captivate and horrify because it strips away the illusion of permanence and reveals with stark clarity the vulnerable humanity behind even the most absolute of powers.
What shocked you most about Henry's final days? Comment below. And don't forget to subscribe for more dark truths from history's forgotten corners.